Thank you very much. Before I begin, let me just say, give a very heartfelt thanks to KDI and the Ministry of Strategy and Finance for putting this together. It's really been a wonderful experience, and I'm very, very happy to be here. So given what has been said, so I'm moderating, but I figured I would start up here rather than introducing myself and then walking over. Given what has already been said about the costs and benefits of the sharing economy, I made some slight changes to my presentation to talk more about the peer-to-peer economy rather than the sharing economy more generally. And in specific, I'll talk about new labor intermediaries in the peer-to-peer economy. Groups like Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, Handy, and the like. My research is based on the United States and the European Union, so this probably won't translate perfectly to the Korean context, but I do believe there are a number of similarities, and I'm very interested in your reactions and thoughts on this. So just to outline what I'll talk about, I think it's important to put the rise of peer-to-peer platforms like Uber and others in the context of the broad shift in production strategies that we've seen over the last 50 years in the core OECD economies, from vertically integrated production in national economies to production through networks, often across national borders. This has led to governance by contracts rather than employment relationships, and has often ended up eroding workers' bargaining power in the US and EU economies especially. So talk about kind of that set of changes, how employment relationships and industrial relations have actually changed during that time period, really 1970 to the present. Then I'll give some evidence about the impact so far of peer-to-peer companies on the labor market in the United States. There's not great evidence, but there is some. And then finally talk about some possible regulatory responses. I should say off the bat, so far the peer-to-peer economy in the US, it's getting an awful lot of attention, obviously, but it is a relatively small piece of the overall economy. And this is one of the reasons why I want to talk about it in this broader context. Now, what its future is a different question. There is a good chance it will expand dramatically. So getting a handle on some of these questions, I think, is especially important. So I'll start with our good friend Ronald Coase, who was introduced yesterday, and his basic notion of transaction costs and the size of the firm. He said in his 1937 classic piece, "Firms are islands of conscious power in this ocean of unconscious cooperation," that's the market, "like lumps of butter coagulating in a pail of buttermilk." Buttermilk, I guess, was a bigger part of people's lives in 1937 than it is today. But the basic idea is that why do we have the firm? To minimize transaction costs of going to the market. This is well known. What's less well known is the way that Coase also linked this to the notion of the employment relationship. So he said the fact of direction is the essence of the concept of employer and employee, just as it is in the economic concept of the firm. One takes someone into an employment relationship in order to avoid some of the transaction costs of an arm's length market relationship. And the very common law definition of employment, and this is true in civil law countries for the most part as well, reflects the notion that one party is controlling another. Party A is being directed by Party B, and so Party B is often responsible for what Party A does. Moreover, Party B owes certain duties to Party A by virtue of that relationship. Now, this was how the employment relationship in its standard classical form was central to the organization of the advanced economies in the 20th century. Here I have a picture of Ford's River Rouge complex. This was the largest factory in the world in 1928. 100,000 employees, you had raw materials at one end and cars coming out the other end. And it was a model of Taylorist production, a vertically integrated firm, very high capital costs. Workers were unionized with industry-level bargaining in the US. But then, most importantly, you had very clear and hierarchical definition of tasks from management delegated to workers, and close supervision of workers in performing those tasks. Now, and that gave us the basic model of employment, a long-term relationship that involves control or command. It has regular hours, task definition. It's tied up with this model of production. Of course, the welfare states in most countries imposed duties on firms for two reasons. One, the firm was a very effective means of risk pooling. And second, the broad sense that firms had moral duties toward their employees to treat them fairly. This is no longer the world we live in. At least, vertical integration remains in some sectors, but it's been replaced in many sectors by more arm's-length contractual relationships. This is a slide from a famous article from 2006 by Gary Gireffi and co-authors about global value chains and different ways of organizing production through a combination of contract and command relationships. So you have integrated firms all the way over on the right-hand side, moving all the way to markets on the left-hand side. And this is how production is increasingly organized in the contemporary economy through arm's-length relationships, also linking across national borders. Another example of the transformation is the growth of Walmart as the dominant retailer in the US and, I believe, the world. Walmart gets a lot of bad press for their labor practices, but more important to their overall success has been their supply chain management. Their close connection to and monitoring of their suppliers, both for quality control and to ensure the quick movement of goods across borders. Peer-to-peer is, I would submit, another manifestation of some of the same phenomena. The basic economics here are simple and were discussed a bit yesterday. Once a platform eliminates transaction costs between consumers or between purchasers and sellers, all sorts of contracts will be entered into that otherwise wouldn't occur. Now, there's actually plenty of hierarchy in the platforms, Uber and TaskRabbit and the like. There's lots of definition of what tasks can be performed, and to some extent how they have to be performed. There's a fair amount of control, but still the production structure itself is a bit different. The relationships are temporary. Workers have a good deal more autonomy. So where are we seeing this model emerging? A number of platforms now moving into sectors of traditional consumer services. Munchery, preparing and delivering food. Ship, preparing and delivering packages and letters. Washio, to do laundry. One backstory here, of course, is the widespread entry of women into the workplace creates demand for all sorts of services that used to be performed in the household. And some of these companies are tapping that set of markets. We also have companies that are doing more straightforward labor intermediation. This is a picture of an old shape-up on a dock, I believe in San Francisco. Dock workers would show up every day and volunteer to work, and then some of them would get selected and some would not. It was a source of corruption and mob-related violence and the like. How are we doing this today? Well, I think Uber, TaskRabbit, Handy, MyClean are performing a similar function. They are acting as the person mediating between people who want to buy services and people who want to sell services. TaskRabbit, if you don't know, is a platform through which individuals can hire other individuals for short-term tasks, home cleaning, repairs around the house, assembling furniture, yard work, whatever it is. MyClean is a market for MyClean and Handy, actually, are markets largely for home cleaning services. Care.com for child care and elder care hasn't taken off quite as quickly as the others. So I want to understand this against the backdrop of changes in employment and industrial relations. I've referred to some of this already, so I'll move through it a little bit quickly. Why did we have this shift? Why did we move from vertical integration to all of these forms of intermediated, disaggregated production? Well, law is part of the story. Broad changes to actually promote global markets, some changes in labor laws within domestic economies. A lot of the story is economics. You know, there are many factors here. The growth of the global labor market is an incredibly important one. Information technology also plays a role both in Walmart's operations and in peer-to-peer platforms by reducing monitoring costs and so enabling contracting that otherwise might have required a firm. In the case of Uber and some of the peer-to-peer networks, information tech is enabling network effects. I'll talk about that more in just a moment. But there's a final aspect, norms. At least in the US and EU, there's been a significant shift away from economic distribution as the real primary social ill and toward understanding discrimination as a primary social ill. I don't want to overstate the importance of that shift, but I do think it's important. So, and alongside this, we've had very significant changes in employment and in industrial relations. So employment trends in the OECD countries. Declining employment in the industrial core, increasing employment in services. This has gone along with increasing income inequality and more part-time, subcontracted, and self-employment. I have a star there because the empirics on the growth of contingent work are actually disputed. Some economists say this has been overstated. Others say that it has not been overstated, it's a matter of measurement. But I'll just hang a star on it for that reason. And then a couple of core legal and regulatory issues that emerge here, changes in industrial systems and workplace rights. This is kind of key. How have our industrial relations systems changed in this period? You can see a couple patterns. In the US and UK, you see deunionization. Unions simply dropping out of the picture, no longer being able to organize or maintain their market share. And now we have localized bargaining, low coverage, and relatively high levels of inequality, part of the shift toward informal styles of production. Germany is the paradigm case of what's known as labor market dualism. You still have centralized bargaining in the industrial core, and often very powerful unions in the industrial core, but then a lot of non-union work with low wages in the periphery. So a real division between segments of workers in Germany. My sense is there's quite a few parallels to Korea here, but I don't know the industrial relations here that well. Denmark is a third model, and in some ways a more promising one. Here you have unions that cover most workers, but the bargaining takes place largely at the national level. As importantly, the workers who are unskilled and in the service sector are also in the labor movement. And so those workers have been able to actually check the power of the unions in the industrial core and drive a bit more wage compression, lead to a little less inequality between the two sectors, and also to enhance labor market participation by women and others, you know, non-native citizens and the like. The source of this is a great book by Kathleen Thalen, who's at MIT, called Varieties of Liberalization, tracing out this broad set of changes in industrial policy. Second broad set of changes, can I have my water actually? Or actually I'll just say it. So it's who's an employee and who's an independent contractor? Again, Coase said the fact of direction determines the scope of the firm as well as the scope of the employment relationship. Once contract can be used effectively to set up work relationships, a lot of workers are classified as independent contractors rather than employees. That has enormous consequences for those workers because then they're not eligible for various employment protections, wage and hour laws, expense reimbursements, social insurance. The test remains, as I say, the right to control the work. This is being litigated in the US right now, and I can talk about it at great length in the Q&A if you'd like, but I'll say quickly now, it's very unclear where Uber and Lyft drivers and other peer-to-peer platform workers fall, whether they will be classified as employees or contractors. And the judge in the Lyft case was very nicely straightforward about this. He said the jury will be handed a square peg and asked to choose between two round holes. They're not exactly employees, they're not exactly contractors. We have a new model of employment here, and we have to figure out what to do about it. Okay, so before talking about possible regulatory solutions, what do we know so far about the labor standards impact of these peer-to-peer platforms? So here's the standard take from a broad segment in the United States that has made its way into the presidential campaign from an online magazine called Jacobin. Sharing economy companies like Uber shift risk from corporations to workers, weaken labor protections, and drive down wages. Hillary Clinton said something similar to this the other day. Bernie Sanders has been saying it. Is it empirically correct? Well, as I've been saying, this is, I think, part of a broad trend toward more informal work relationships, and so we may be confusing correlation and causation here. My sense is that the strong reaction to Uber in the US is driven in part by concerns about increasing inequality in American politics, not necessarily by a realistic assessment of its impact on labor standards. It is also, as I said, still a small segment of the economy, so it's not clear, how scalable it will be, though there's certainly a lot of potential. So what's my take on this? Well, one way to think about Uber, the way that they describe their own business model, is that it is creating an important network effect that delivers far greater efficiency in the market in which they're operating. Boston Mark yesterday, as opposed to San Francisco Mark, mentioned that Uber's success in the US resulted in part from the fact that taxi service was just abysmal. And I think that's right. Part of the notion here is that by creating an online network, they're able to fill their cars more often than traditional taxis, because taxis don't have to, for example, drive around looking for fares. And our telephone-style taxi hailing in the US has often been quite bad. The possibility here is that they're able to offer lower prices and still offer higher wages to employees. So is this a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle? The virtuous cycle, higher wages despite lower prices. Uber, serves as a bridge of employment for many people. The increase in supply for cars actually creates demand for those cars, and so we don't have as much displacement from the taxi cab sector. This, I think, reflects one of the economic models outlined yesterday about the impact of these new companies on incumbents. But possibly a vicious cycle if the innovations just involve avoiding regulations. Uber drivers, may bear additional costs of car maintenance. They don't have a whole lot of job security. Uber's, some of its practices may involve getting workers into car leases that they can't afford in the long term. So, okay, data. Hall and Kruger did a major study on this last year that was funded by Uber, but Alan Kruger is actually a very well-regarded and independent economist. This is not in the handout you have. I apologize. What they find, drivers very much value flexibility. They tend to work shorter hours than taxi drivers. They're younger, they're higher educated, they're more often white and native born. They earn more. Now that $19 an hour figure does not reflect deductions for car insurance, vehicle expenses, and other work-related benefits. Importantly, though, taxi drivers also usually don't get those benefits in the US. They don't have to pay as much for automobile depreciation because they don't own the cars, but they also don't get workers' compensation and the like. Another very important study, this is Arun Sundararajan at NYU, who's been looking at wage rates for various categories of work organized by TaskRabbit in San Francisco. The dots that are above the line, these are sectors in which workers on TaskRabbit are making more than the reported wages for those occupations from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So in other words, for carpentry, the reported wage is around $30 an hour. On TaskRabbit, it's around $38 an hour. Plumbing, reported wage is around $38. TaskRabbit, it's around $45. Under the line are jobs where TaskRabbit is actually paying less. Now, what explains this? Part of it is site specificity. So a lot of the work above the line here, this is work that can only be done from one place. Below the line, computer user support, graphic design, writing and editing can be done anywhere. So the workers below the line are competing in a global labor market. Now, one difficult question here is whether these platforms are displacing traditional workers from these jobs because many of the people on them are actually college educated. And so there may be a difficult distributional effect involved there. Final aspect is, when you have platforms that are based on user ratings, those ratings do a very good job of sorting out who is a decent versus terrible employee, but they also very likely create incentives for workers to act in a somewhat subservient way. Many workers have said they feel this aspect, they feel this in Uber. If you've ever worked in a restaurant in the United States, you have experienced this. You're expected to be somewhat docile in relation to the customers. This is from Uber's own materials, and I think it just captures this brilliantly. You have the sort of Wall Street or venture capital or startup guy getting out of a Mercedes, and his driver is looking at him longingly, happy to merely be associated with this member of the 1%, right? Uber sort of rejoices in this sort of imagery. I think this explains a lot of their bad public image. Okay, so to assess. Are we creating more efficient and inclusive markets? Maybe. We've got higher wages on platforms, but maybe a substitution effect. If some of these companies grow very large, you could see monopsony concerns. I don't think we're there yet, but it does seem possible. At the same time, greater autonomy for workers that really should not be discounted. A lot of workers really value their flexibility. At the same time, are they being required to act in a subservient way toward their clients or not? Also, the job flexibility without guaranteed, transition assistance or anything is just a recipe for precarious economic condition. Okay, so what to do? I think there are three options. One is so-called responsive regulation. This is all in the US context, of course. Regulators can work with peer-to-peer companies to actually ensure that their employees are having a good experience and receiving basic work-related benefits. The second is to move toward flexicurity, which I mentioned before. Have substantial worker protections, but also more flexible labor markets. And there are some models of this. It's politically challenging to get there, but it does seem to balance the equities quite nicely. Finally, and this hasn't really received much attention yesterday or today, encourage worker cooperatives, which may really be an option in a number of these sectors. Okay, so responsive regulation, what do I mean? Disaggregated industries, they end up lowering costs for consumers. They're also very difficult to regulate. Why? Because you have too many parties, and there's no one party you can hold accountable to ensure decent conditions. This was a virtue of vertically integrated production. If Ford workers wanted a raise, they went to Ford. Ford would give them a raise if they won, right? It's very, very difficult to do in taxi markets, especially that are highly disaggregated. Hundreds of medallion owners, management companies, drivers that are leasing cabs. There's no one who can drive an equitable solution here. Uber actually changes this, or at least their technology does, right? Because now all of a sudden you don't have vertical integration, but every driver has a direct relationship with Uber. And this is true of TaskRabbit, it's true of Handy, right? It's true of many other platforms like this. And I'll note, sort of the platforms for home-based cleaners, for example, that is work that has been informal and poorly paid for a very, very long time. It's a cash economy, for the most part right now. If that work goes to an online platform, regulators can actually require the companies to monitor that it's being done in an appropriate way. There's a real advantage here over existing regulatory structures. Second option, there's a lot of discussion now about reforming employee benefits. This is an acute concern in the US because for reasons that are sort of a historical accident, a great deal of our social policy depends on employment. And that's not just, that ends up limiting job creation, but it's also unfair to employees in many ways because it creates incentives for employers to use contracting relationships rather than employment. Also, employment is a kind of all or nothing game. Not exactly, but mostly in the US. If you're an employee, you have access to a full suite of benefits. If you're a contractor, you have access to nothing. So can we disaggregate that? One option is create more benefits portability, accounts that workers can carry from one job to another. Another is to create a so-called dependent contractor category that would have limited employment benefits. I would suggest that this would be difficult in the US, obviously, but a solution that would balance this would be something approaching flexicurity. So you give employers flexibility to hire and fire and to manage as they see fit. You have generous welfare benefits provided by the state, which means that workers, when they lose a job, are not destitute. They have some unemployment support and training and the like. And then you have what's known as active labor market policies, efforts to really train workers and get them into other jobs quickly. Flexible employment relationships together with security. That's how you get the idea of flexicurity. Now, one of the challenges here is that the political backdrop to this model has in the past been very broad and powerful unions. It's a very important aspect very important in the European context, as I said before. Today, is there another institution that can serve that role, aggregating workers' voices and actually giving them some power to help negotiate a deal with the state and with employers? Maybe. Maybe it's something other than traditional unions. Maybe unions' powers can be disaggregated in certain ways. Maybe online organizations can spring up that can do some of this. That's starting to happen in the US. Another thing that could be done here is to make it easier for workers to establish that they are legal employees, at least for wages and hours and other economic terms, which I think do appropriately belong on the employer or on the company that's using their labor, while other benefits might be appropriately put onto the state. I think the dependent contractor proposal is actually unwise because there's a basic conceptual problem in distinguishing employment from contracting. This ties courts in knots in the US and in many other countries, and I think if we create a third category, it's only going to make that problem worse. So final proposal, is it possible to think about cooperative platforms? Now this strikes me as very intriguing in the Korean context, potentially because there is not yet such a dense infrastructure of incumbent firms that are in the space. States and policymakers can start from scratch a little bit more than can be done in the US. When do cooperatives work? When there's not a whole lot of R&D involved and when participants are roughly equal contributors. Uber is, it's an aggressive corporation with global ambitions. It's also a technology. And the technology can be replicated. And the question is, can the technology be replicated and can workers actually themselves own parts of the company and manage the company democratically so that they, they have true flexibility and true control over their working conditions. How to do this, and here I'll end. There's a couple classic challenges for co-ops. One is access to capital, because banks, prefer to lend to more stable players, as we heard in the last session. Could that be solved through crowdfunding? I have that here. Could it be solved through active state policy to encourage co-ops? Perhaps also. Another is workers' risk aversion. It's hard to convince a worker to join a cooperative if they're not guaranteed a particular salary from that co-op, right? Until the co-op gets started and really off the ground, until the model is proven, it can be quite difficult. Enhanced sort of social benefits may help with that to encourage a little more risk-taking. It's another thing to consider. The final, and this is in some ways the most interesting, a lot of successful co-ops operate at a very local level. a very small number of workers, a small number of players. Is it possible to use online platforms to set up co-ops that remain democratic while also being efficient? So there are some very interesting experiments going on in Europe and the US on new forms of democratic participation online. And I'd be very interested to see if those could be brought to bear as a governance structure for new cooperatives. Okay, with that I have 5 seconds left, so I guess I'll end. Thank you so much, and I'll look forward to your questions.